Hello and welcome to APTN National News this beautiful Friday evening. I'm your host, Sav Jonesa. At the beginning of the month, the Manitoba government amended the Child and Family Services Act. The new amendments aim to keep children with their family and communities and to ensure parents get the support they need. On Friday, Families Minister Nahanni Fontaine unveiled the province's plan to transform the child welfare system. APTN Sierra Beddens has more.
It's a legal amendment that Cynthia Broadfoot believes would have changed her family's life.
Had I had that, our family would have had a lot of support and input, and they may have only been in the system a year or two. Had I had what we have now.
On October 1st, Manitoba's Child and Family Services Act was officially amended to introduce 4 new agreement types: family support, and customary kinship and voluntary care. In a press conference on Friday, the Manitoba government announced the amendments. Families Minister Nahanni Fontaine said the hope is fewer children in care and more parents playing an active role in their lives.
We are empowering family members, Indigenous nations, community, and kin, while ensuring the child welfare system works with parents who need additional support, better meeting the needs of both Manitoba children and families.
While kinship care involves placing children with family or close kin, customary care focuses on keeping children in their culture and community. Voluntary care allows parents to temporarily place their children under CFS care. A family support agreement involves an agency connecting families to resources and financial assistance. Poplar River Chief Vera Mitchell supports the amendments. At the same time, she said First Nations must be given full jurisdiction over child welfare matters.
People always reference Indigenous child welfare agencies. They're not. They belong to the province. I want to clarify that all the announcements that are made are things that we've always done with our families. And it's not something new, like customary care is not something new, and supports for families is nothing new. The only thing that's attached to it is funding to help to facilitate those resources.
In May, Manitoba signed a declaration vowing to transfer child welfare jurisdiction to First Nations. The province has also dedicated approximately $10 million to Indigenous agencies to support customary and kinship care. Sierra Beddens, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
A new special report by the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth looks at sleep-related infant deaths in the province. It's a dire situation, says the report.
Titled Shifting the Lens, the report looks at the circumstances surrounding the sleep-related deaths of 48 infants in Manitoba between 2019 and 2021. It found that 81% of the infants who died were Indigenous, and 27% of the deaths occurred in First Nations communities. 64% of infants who died were living in overcrowded homes, and 1 in 3 households didn't have a safe sleep surface available for the babies. 69% of the families had degrees of involvement with child and family services at the time of or in the year prior to the infant's death. The report also found that 70% of the infant's biological mothers were known to be victims of intimate partner violence, and half of the mothers experienced some form of abuse or neglect as children.
Ultimately, this report demonstrates that risk for sleep-related infant deaths do not derive from individual decisions, behaviors, and practices, but also from the conditions of people's daily lives and the wider set of factors and systems that shape them. These are known as the social determinants of health and are factors over which caregivers and families often have very little control. Therefore, it is unfair and ineffective to place the burden of prevention of sleep-related infant deaths solely on the shoulders of caregivers.
A new piece of legislation was tabled in the House of Commons today. It's called Bill C-77, and it will create a commissioner for modern treaty implementation. That person will ensure governments now and in the future uphold modern treaty obligations. Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Gary Anandasangari shared the stage with several First Nations leaders who all support the establishment of this type of commissioner that will be independent of government and report to it like an auditor general. But Anandasangari was asked if Bill C-77 will be passed by Parliament because the Liberal government is currently accusing the Conservative Party of obstruction, which they say is preventing House business from proceeding smoothly.
You know, this bill didn't start a few weeks ago. This started 20 years ago as the demands of treaty partners to ensure that there's accountability. It's important that our government and any future governments do not politicize the relationship with treaty partners. And I believe that this is a moment for all parties to come together to support the bill.
After 8 months of traveling across Mi'kma'ki, Senator Paul Prosper released a report called Reconciliation. It's a result of speaking to over 1,700 people in every Mi'kmaq community from Newfoundland to Gaspé region in Quebec. Angel Moore spoke to Senator Prosper about the report.
Treaty Day parades happen every October 1st when the Mi'kmaq honor the 1752 Peace and Friendship Treaty, signed with the Crown to promise peace and protect Mi'kmaq hunting and fishing rights. A fitting day for Mi'kmaq Senator P.J. Prosper to release a report called Reconciliation, an analysis of issues impacting Mi'kmaq communities.
We're going to share it with all parliamentarians, all senators, all members of Parliament, ministers, PMO, you know, because it's important for them to know the issues that exist for the Mi'kmaq people.
Prosper and his team traveled for 8 months to over 28 Mi'kmaq communities and organizations across the Atlantic region. Leadership and community members shared their concerns. Prosper says governance was a common issue.
A core feature of governance related to the recognition and respect for Mi'kmaq rights, and whether they be Aboriginal and treaty rights. And so a lot of things flow from that.
Prosper says Mi'kmaq policing and safety is also a concern. Since 2020, in separate incidences, several Indigenous people were fatally shot by police during wellness checks in Atlantic Canada.
Communities were quite consistent in terms of their need, expressing their need for communities to be safe. And there are a number of things that are happening as it currently exists within the negotiation of policing agreements.
According to the report, the second highest concern was health. Eskazoni Chief Leroy Denny said his First Nation needs a hospital within the community, citing systemic racism and racial profiling within healthcare.
The matter of racism and discrimination or discrimination being a systemic reality and circumstance for Mi'kmaq communities is something that was brought up on many occasions. It existed pretty well wherever we traveled.
Prosper acknowledges there are numerous reports on Indigenous issues, but says this one is unique.
Now is the time to move forward, to set an agenda, to allow all parliamentarians to know what the unique realities that exist, you know, for the Mi'kmaq people. So it's essentially going to guide my work here in Ottawa.
Angel Moore, APTN National News, Djibouti, also known as Halifax.
We want to hear what you think about that story or any other you hear tonight. Here's how to continue the conversation. If you have a story you want to share, send us an email to news@aptn.ca. To read and watch our stories, go to aptnnews.ca. You can find us online on your favorite social media sites, including TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. Follow APTN News to join the conversation and see our latest stories. This summer saw 2 historic court cases take place in Manitoba. After the break, we hear from the judge who presided over them. Stay tuned. You've probably heard his name in our reporting over the years. Glenn Joyle has been the Chief Justice of Manitoba Court of King's Bench since 2011. This past summer, he presided over 2 court cases APTN followed closely. A trial that found serial killer Jeremy Skabicki guilty of 4 first-degree murders for Rebecca Comtois, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Buffalo Woman. And earlier this month, he acquitted Clarence Woodhouse for wrongful conviction of a murder from the 1970s. He sat down with T.R. Wheatley recently to talk about those recent trials, the calls to justice from MMIWG inquiry, judicial reconciliation, and the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP.
Skabicki is such a unique situation in the sense that it really was, for so many people, emblematic of everything that the missing murdered women and girls inquiry was all about. So we really had a responsibility, I think, obviously to ensure that the accused in that case had a fair trial, but we also had a responsibility to ensure that deeply felt trauma by all the victims' families, but also the larger community, was properly addressed in a trial. There was present in the courtroom, certain things that I think were meaningful, not just for what it was representing in terms of the legal issues, but also for our court's efforts at judicial reconciliation.
You mentioned that the National Inquiry legal document. I want to speak to certain calls to justice and how you're trying to implement those here.
We have to be humble with respect to how much we can do in responding to some of those recommendations. The justice system obviously involves many actors, so we're not involved in the investigative role, we're not involved in the prosecutorial part of things. We simply adjudicate, we judge, we assess, whether it's a judge alone or with a jury. But to the extent that those cases come to us, I think we have a real responsibility to ensure that we handle them as quickly as we can, but also if we're not dealing with them in a way that's sufficiently, I think, sensitive, empathetic, and responsive to what are the unique challenges facing that type of investigation, that type of prosecutions.
The Woodhouse, his conviction, 50 years. Talk about that trial and the injustices.
Well, it's a tragedy. So when it happens because of bad identity, a lack of disclosure, the way the case might have been prosecuted, or the way the case might have been adjudicated and judged, that's not a good thing. Well, the same case involving, I think, Mr. Woodhouse's brother 2 years ago. Those are cases for which the system has a hard time offering an explanation. One of the ways we have to do that is when we see cases that can be identifiably called systemic discrimination, we have to call it out, and we have to address it, and we have to apologize for it.
What are some of the changes you've implemented generally, but also, in relation to Indigenous people?
So in every area where we've tried to make improvements, and they don't just relate to the Indigenous communities, but a lot of them do, we've tried to make things less costly, less complex, and more quick. One is child protection. The Family Division brought in some very important reforms that, in the context of these tragic apprehensions, sped up the process because it was happening for too long. Is a situation where these kids who were apprehended were in limbo, sometimes for 24, 36 months. And bad things happen when children are apprehended and they remain in limbo. Phoenix Sinclair is a good example, right? Similarly, in the criminal law, we've tried to do that as well. Because as you know, unfortunately, it's more likely once an Indigenous person is arrested for that person to be denied bail. They don't get out. So the socioeconomic realities make it much more difficult for them to get out on bail pending a trial. 2017, where I struck a committee, it's called the Trust, Reconciliation, and Access to Justice Committee. So it's TRAC in short. This is a committee made up of about 7 or 8 judges and now 5 community members. Some significant participation by Indigenous community members. We're educating ourselves about Indigenous legal traditions, Indigenous legal orders, those things that I think are increasingly part of what it is Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities want us to understand and in fact incorporate and integrate to the extent we can into our own processes. As well, the education is basically exposing ourselves to individuals who come and teach us and talk to us. Nagan Sinclair, for example, came and did a half morning on UNDRIP. Judges were very interested and very engaged. We're not doing enough sort of in community or on the land training yet, but we're planning that as well. The other 2 pieces are big systemic change and smaller systemic change. A good example of that is what we did 2 or 3 years ago when we brought in the Eagle Feather. Really meaningful, I think, step, but it wasn't done. The bigger systemic change involves ways that we might collaborate with or sometimes get out of the way of initiatives that are being brought by Indigenous communities in respective ways they're assuming now what they believe is their own jurisdiction. And you're going to start seeing more and more of that, I think, in child protection. And you're going to start seeing the development of that as various courts, including the Supreme Court of Canada, address the extent to which Section 35 and the Indigenous right of self-determination plays out and evolves in a fashion that's going to require courts maybe to re-examine how we either work with, collaborate, or coexist with Indigenous justice systems and certainly Indigenous legal traditions.
Let's talk about UNDRIP. From your perspective.
Well, UNDRIP is a thing. It's now been adopted in a way in Canada where we as a judiciary have to deal with it and have to understand it and understand that it's going to have implications for how we interpret our own governing law. We're going to be even better placed, I think, able to bring a perspective that will better reflect what it is we have to do when we're dealing with issues that touch Indigenous issues, whether it's a duty to consult case, whether it's a matter in the criminal realm, or whether it's a matter respecting a child welfare issue. All of that is now going to play out in ways that I think are going to be in some way connected to the broad principles and ideals of UNDRIP. So we have to deal with it.
Thank you, TR, for the highlights of that sit-down interview with Chief Justice Joyle. If you want to hear more from their conversation, the full sit-down interview can be found on APTN News YouTube channel. We're going to take one last break now, and we'll be back in just a few moments. Stick around. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. A beautiful orange sunset over Allison Bay near Fort Chipewyan, Alberta. Great picture shared by Sunny Piche. Send your autumn pictures to share@aptn.ca to be featured on APTN National News. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast.
Let's see what tomorrow has in store for us. It'll be 12 in St. John's and 14 in Charlottetown. Looks like rain for both. It will be 7 in rain in Nain and 9 in rain in Cartwright. Rainy in Quebec. Quebec City will be 10 and 12 in Montreal with some sun. London will be sunny and 16 and sun and 15 in Toronto. Wawa will be 11 and it'll be 9 and some rain in Timmins. Churchill will be 2, 10 in Thompson. Saturday we'll see 16 in rain in Gimli and 13 in rain in Winnipeg. It will be sunny and 17 in Estevan, 12 and some cloud in Yorkton. Stony Rapids and Uranium City will be 7, 9 and lots of sun in Buffalo Narrows. Sunny in northern Alberta. Let's see, it's 9 in High Level and it will be 10 in Fort McMurray. 14 in Edmonton and Calgary, 13 in Red Deer. Vancouver will be 16 and sunny and 21 in sun in Kamloops. It'll be 16 in Prince George and 11 in Fort Nelson. Whitehorse will be 10 and rainy and 0 in possible snow in Old Crow. Yellowknife will be 5 and 7 in Norman Wells. Sax Harbor will be 0, Colville Lake will be 4. Arviat will be -3 in snow and -2 in Cambridge Bay. Iqaluit will be 3 and -5 in Resolute.
APTN Investigates returns this week with an all-new episode. Investigative journalist Brittany Guillot looks into the mystery surrounding the death of Charles Odie. Odie's body was found wedged in a Vancouver storm drain in 2015. Authorities declared his death an accident, but his family has never stopped searching for answers. With more on this story, Brittany joins us now from our Winnipeg newsroom. Thanks so much for joining us, Brittany. What are the details surrounding Charles Odie's death?
Thanks for having me on. So Charles was a First Nations man living in Vancouver, BC at the time. One evening in September 2015, he and a group of his friends decided to go out for a night on the town. Over the course of that night, they visited several different establishments, and eventually the group ended up back at a friend's house. And around 4 in the morning, Charles was asked to leave the residence, and the details thereafter are disturbing. Charles was found upside down and headfirst wedged into a storm drain. His pants were sitting at thigh level. He was found with no socks or shoes on, and his personal items were scattered across the back alley where he was found. And so it's important to note that the storm drain that he was found in was approximately 4 feet in length, whereas Charles stood tall at about 6 feet. And so this is just one instance in which the Odie family says that the circumstances surrounding his death are suspicious.
Absolutely. And so what led to the closure of the investigation?
So the case was initially closed just a couple days after Charles's death. And so the Odie family wasn't happy with the progress of the investigation, so they filed a formal complaint with the police department. And shortly thereafter, the case was reopened as a homicide investigation and then closed again in 2017. So it's unclear why there was this back and forth of closing, reopening, closing, but Eugenia Odie filed a Freedom of Information request and shared that with APTN Investigates, and we get into the police investigation details in our episode.
Okay, and what has the response been like from authorities?
So far, the responses from the Vancouver Police Department and the BC Coroner's Service has been pretty tight-lipped, offering very little in the way of new information. And the Odie family has gone as far as to say that the treatment of Charles Odie's investigation has mirrored very similarly to what we've seen play out with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And they are going to continue searching for answers, and they ask that if anybody has any new information regarding Charles Odie's death, to please come forward.
Okay, well, we'll need to end it there, Brittany, but thanks so much for the preview, and I'm looking forward to watching tomorrow.
Thanks for having me on.
You can catch APTN Investigates Echoes from the Drain, airing this Saturday night on APTN. Well, that's all the time we have for your APTN National News tonight. Thanks for tuning in. If you're looking for more stories, please visit our website at aptnnews.ca. I'm Sav Jonesa, and from all of us here at APTN, take care of each other and have a great Thanksgiving weekend.